What's up, everybody? This is Mr. Richardson coming at you live through the power of the internet. And what we're going to be talking about today is how do we use and conduct sample surveys so that we can collect data that does not contain any bias. This lesson is going to be a lot different than all of the other videos that I've created. There is not a lot of mathematical calculation. The point of this lesson is really to become an informed citizen. There is so much data that is shown to you every day in the news, and much of it is not collected accurately. If a newspaper conducts a survey about the number of people that approve of something, whether it's a presidential candidate or even a new type of medicine, you have to wonder if there's any bias in that survey. Every news article, every advertisement is always trying to convince you to do something, and sometimes it's done appropriately, but often it's done inappropriately. And today is going to teach you how to conduct a survey so that it's not biased, and how to look at a survey and decide if there is bias in it. Let's jump into some definitions. So the first thing you need to know is whenever we conduct a survey, we're always trying to find information about an entire population of people. And now when I say population, I'm not just talking about everyone in the world, but I'm talking about a certain group of people. However, the majority of the time that we're doing one of these surveys, it's impossible to collect data on everyone. So we just look at a smaller, what we're going to call sample, to judge the population. So the first thing you should know is the definition of population, and that's just the group that the researcher wants to know something about. Now, of course, we can't always ask everyone in the population, so what we do as a researcher is we look at a sample. A sample is the smaller part of the population that we randomly select and observe to obtain our data. So here's an example. Let's say I wanted to know information about New York City voters. Let's say the mayor was up and we wanted to see who's going to vote for the new mayor. Well, it's going to be impossible for me to ask every single person that's eligible to vote who they're going to vote for in New York City. So instead, what I would do is I would ask a smaller subset of the population and see who they're going to vote for. So maybe the sample is I stand outside of the Union Square subway station, and every 15th person that walks by that is of age to vote, I just simply ask them, hey, who do you plan on voting for? In this way, I would randomly be selecting a subset or a sample of the population and asking them information that is going to indicate how many New York City voters would vote for a presidential candidate. This process is called a sample survey. It's called a sample survey because you're surveying a sample of the population. So the definition here of a sample survey is it's the collection of data from a randomly chosen sample. Notice in the last example, I was just randomly asking every 15th person that left the subway station. The sample is going to be that part of the population of interest and must be chosen randomly from the whole population. The data drawn from the sample is used to make inferences about the population. The random selection of individuals to the sample is necessary to prevent any bias in the selection process, which may cause the sample to be unrepresentative of the population. So what are some examples of a sample survey? Well, it could be a political poll. I might want to know who is going to vote for the next president. Of course, I can't ask everyone, so I would ask a sample of people to indicate which way the voting is going to do. Another example of a sample survey could be a student perception survey. Maybe you're familiar with those, where we ask students how they feel about being in a class, how they feel about the culture of a school. I'm not able to ask every student, so I just ask a sample of the population. Finally, another example could be American Idol voting. When we're seeing who's going to be the next American Idol, we're asking people to vote on who they think it should be. And of course, not everybody is going to vote. Only a sample of people actually call in and vote. Well, with surveys, they're not always done accurately, and there can be some bias or things that make it unrepresentative of the population. And I'm going to point out some examples of some different types of bias that can happen when creating sample surveys. The first type of bias we call response bias, and response bias is when the subject's answer is influenced by the condition of asking the question. The example here is think about a survey that was asking about academic dishonesty. Maybe the school principal conducts a survey asking if you've ever copied someone's homework or cheated on a test. The fact that the school principal is conducting the survey would maybe make you hesitant to do it honestly. You might have copied someone's homework sometime, and when asked by the principal, you might say, hey, no, I never actually copied anyone's homework in my life. Or had this survey been conducted by a peer or someone in your class, you might answer it more accurately. So response bias is the first thing that could give us an unrepresentative response. The second type of bias is called the non-response bias. In this case, it's when the survey is not answered or someone refuses to participate. For instance, all the time I get surveys sent to me in the mail, and I don't respond to them because I simply don't have enough time. They keep coming and I just keep throwing them out. Or think about if you've done something online and maybe you purchase something and a pop-up jumps up and it says, hey, would you like to take 5 minutes to fill out this survey? Often you don't fill out the survey because you don't have the time or just don't want to. In this case, with the non-response bias, not everyone is participating. Only the people that have a lot of time are going to participate. Voluntary response bias is very similar. In voluntary response bias, it's when a call and a write-in response. Something is not required. Think about American Idol voting. You watch the show and they say, hey, who do you think is going to be the next American Idol? Vote in. For me, I've watched American Idol plenty of times, and guess what? I've never called in because I just don't care to call in. But some people may have their cousin or a friend or just someone that they feel passionate about, and they may call in all the time. Well, this changes the population that we're seeing because you're not getting that accurate population. Your sample is really only the people that feel like call or writing in. Another example is think about Yelp reviews. If I go to a restaurant and I have a good meal, I'm never going to go on Yelp and just say, you know what, that meal was just great. I just don't do that. But sometimes if the meal is terrible, I'll go on and I'll leave a Yelp review. In this case, the response or the write-in of the review is not required, so you're only getting a certain type of people to respond. And the last type of bias that we want to talk about is undercoverage bias. That means you're not really covering the whole population. So essentially with undercover population, you're leaving out a section of the population. Think about if you're trying to find out if people like baseball and you only ask people at Yankee Stadium. Well, you're leaving out the part of the population that doesn't like baseball and that isn't at the baseball game. Another example of undercoverage bias was, let's say I was talking to students at a high school and I wanted to know if they thought the amount of homework they were getting is too much. If I only ask the seniors, well, that's an undercoverage bias. I'm not asking the whole population. If I was asking the whole population, I would ask ninth graders, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. By only asking seniors, I'm systematically leaving out a big part of that school population. Finally, before we jump into questions, let's talk about how to prevent bias. There's 3 things that you should keep in mind when trying to prevent bias when creating a survey. The first thing is to make it random. Always use randomization. This is going to prevent voluntary response bias. For instance, if you're going to ask a sample who they're going to vote for in an election, maybe ask like the 10th person that comes out of the subway station. Or maybe you put the numbers 1 through 100 in a hat and you pick a number out, and that number is the person that you ask when they walk out of the subway station. This makes it totally random. Another thing to do is make sure that you have enough coverage. Make sure you cover the entire population. We just talked about asking high school students about some statistic, maybe whether their lunch period is long enough, and not representing everyone. If we only ask the seniors, then we don't really know about the high school, we just know about the seniors. And finally, try to make your sample neutral, which means that you use neutral wording. You don't want to push someone and lean them towards a certain response. The survey should be anonymous, and that would be something that you could do to prevent bias. Let's jump into a few questions. In this question here, we want to know which statement about statistical studies is true. Well, let's go through these together. In the first one, it says a survey of all English classes in a high school would be a good sample to determine the number of hours students throughout the school spend studying. This seems good, thinking that probably everybody takes an English class, so if I survey an English class, it could be a good sample of the school. Everyone is going to take an English class. And that should be representative of the school population, so choice 1 looks pretty good. Let's look at choice 2. Survey the ninth graders in a high school to be a good sample to determine the number of student parking spaces. Well, if you think about a school that does have parking spaces, think about what students need them. Ninth graders wouldn't need parking spaces because they're not old enough to drive. In order to be able to drive in New York, I think you have to be like 16 or 17 years old, which ninth graders wouldn't be. So why would we ask ninth graders how many student parking spaces we need? That sample of ninth graders would be a poor representation of the population. Let's look at Roman numeral 3. A survey of all students in one lunch period in a high school would be a good sample to determine the number of hours adults spend on social media. In this case, the population that we want information about is adults on social media. So why would the sample be students in a cafeteria? Looking at 4, a survey of all calculus students in a high school, that would be a good sample to determine the number of students throughout the school who don't like math. This one is not a good choice either. If the population that I want is students who don't like math, I probably shouldn't be asking students in a calculus class. Calculus is a very upper level math course. So students there have obviously done well in math, and generally speaking, students that have done well in math probably like it. So this would be a poor sample of this population, meaning the answer choice is choice A. Let's try another example. Here, a gas station is conducting a consumer satisfaction survey. Which method of collecting data would most likely lead to a biased sample? Here we're looking for which sample would be random and not give bias. Choice A is very random. If I interview every 5th customer to come into the station, that's really random. Choice B is also a good way to get a sample. It even has random in here, and sure, I could use a computer at checkout that randomly selects which customers. Choice D is also very random. I just interview every customer who comes into the station on a certain day of the week, chosen out of a hat. C would definitely create bias. If I interview customers who call out an 800 number on the receipts, that creates a non-response bias. I know if someone puts something on my receipt that says, hey, do you want to call and say how your satisfaction was today? I'm not going to answer that. I don't have enough time. It could also be a voluntary response bias with who knows what type of people are going to call in. Maybe only people that weren't satisfied and not people that were satisfied. Let's try another example. This question reads that a random sample of 100 people that would best estimate the proportion of all registered voters in a district who support improvements to the high school football field should be drawn from registered voter in the district at A. Football game, B. School fundraiser, C. Supermarket, or D. High school band concert. In this problem, we want to find how many voters support improvements to a high school football field drawn from all of the registered voters. Our population here is all of the registered voters in a certain area. Now, how are we going to accurately know how many registered voters support improving the high school football field? Which one of these would create the most unbiased group of registered voters? Well, if I went to a football game, that would probably be pretty biased. I'm only going to go to a football game if I enjoy football, and if I enjoy football, I'm more likely to say, yeah, improve the high school football field. If I go to a high school fundraiser, I'm there to raise money for the high school. Maybe I have my own children that are in the high school, and I'm pro raising money for the high school. So I don't think that would be a very accurate sample of the registered voters, some of which may not want to raise money for the football field. A supermarket is always a random place to get a sample. Pretty much everyone has to buy food at a supermarket, with the exception of people that maybe are super rich and they have somebody else buy their food at a supermarket. everyone has to get groceries, so that's a pretty random place to draw a sample of registered voters. And a high school band concert, again, you still have people at the high school band concert that may have children in the high school. They're likely to want to support improvements to the high school football field. Choice C would be the best answer here. Let's look at another question. This question reads, the operator of the local mall wants to find out how many of the mall's employees make purchases in the food court when they are working. She hopes to use these data to increase the rent and attract new food vendors. In total, there are 1,023 employees who work at the mall. The best method to obtain a random sample of the employees would be to survey A, all 170 employees at each of the larger stores, B, 50% of the 90 employees of the food court, C, every employee, or D, every 30 employee entering each mall entrance for 1 week. So we want to find out how many of the mall's employees make purchases in the food court when they're not working. Asking every employee would not be a sample. That would just be the whole population, and that's not what we want. We want a random sample. So I'm not going to ask every employee, even though that would be most accurate. I'm not going to choose A, all 170 employees at each of the larger stores, because this here would not cover everyone. I'm only covering the people that work at these big stores like maybe Macy's or I don't know, JCPenney, or one of these larger stores. That's not covering everyone. This one here is not the right sample. The employees of the food court, I want to know about all of the employees of the mall eating at the food court, not just the 90 employees in the food court. That's again a coverage problem. You're not covering the right population. Where choice D is a very random sample. I'm going to interview or ask questions to every 30th employee entering the mall. Let's try one final question. This final question reads that a trucking company has decided to initiate an Employee of the Month program. To determine the recipient, they put the following sign on the back of each truck. It's a bumper sticker that says, "How's my driving? Call this number." The driver who receives the highest number of positive comments will win the recognition. Explain one statistical bias in this data collection method. There is an infinite list of bias with awarding someone Employee of the Month in this fashion. I'm just going to list 3 of them, but really this goes on forever. The first most obvious one that I see is a non-response bias. Only people with the most time are going to call this number. So the Employee of the Month will be the driver who drives behind the most people with a lot of free time, not the person that's the best driver. Another obvious bias here is a voluntary response bias. People are not required to call in, and likely only drivers with negative comments will get phone calls. In this way, how can I see who is going to have the highest number of positive comments, as I'm only going to get phone calls likely that are negative? So there might be a bunch of drivers that don't get any comments, and I wouldn't know who did the best driving. One final one that I thought of, and again, there's an infinite list of these, is this could cover different parts of the population. Some of these drivers may drive in the city and see more potential cars and more potential people, while others may drive in the suburbs or on highways and not come in contact with as many drivers. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you learned a lot about sample surveys. I hope you learned how to conduct them, and also to look for bias when other people are conducting surveys. Until next time.